The red shoes. This has just happened at South Village recently. A woman had been found. She hanged herself home. Jonathan, a leader of the patrol team of the village, had come to the police station to report the case. James and Michael came after him shortly to the crime scene. When reaching the village, Jonathan had to ask people to give way for the police to get in. Jonathan split the crowd and led the way for James and Michael. Jonathan showed them where the woman had hung herself. The police shortly sealed off the area to maintain the evidence. People's curiosities might destroy all of the evidence. James requested Jonathan to support the police in keeping the villagers away from the scene. He put up a glove and stepped into the yard with his right hand. Michael. James and Michael split up to check around the house. James went inside the house while Michael checked around the yard to see if there was anything wrong. Michael went around and checked everything in the front yard and backyard, but he found nothing suspicious. Michael came inside and reported to James that he didn't find anything outside. Once he stepped into the house, he saw the victim was hanging on the roof beam. And the most interesting thing to Michael was the red shoes which the victim had worn. James had a look around the scene and called for Jonathan. Jonathan came in and asked him what James called him for. James wanted to know if anyone had come into the house since they found her hung herself. And if anything in the house had been moved around by anyone. Jonathan told him that there was no one came inside the house since then. The village patrol had taken their shift. As usual, they caught a thief who has prepared to take his action from the outside and found out Sophia had hung herself. The thief didn't even have time to get inside the house. Earlier at South Village, there were many robberies. Being a leader of the village patrol, Jonathan had arranged the team to take 3 times a week. That morning, 2 patrol team members went by the victim's house and found out a thief was looking at her house and wanted to intrude on the house. That was Lucas, a drunkard and jobless man in the village. One of them shouted out what he was doing if he wanted to commit wrongdoing. They grabbed Lucas and gave him a piece of advice. They told Lucas to find a job, and if he wanted to live a life as a thief like that later on, they wanted to take Lucas back to the committee. Lucas begged them to let him go. He told them that he didn't do any wrongdoing. He just opened the door out. He didn't mean anything. Please let me go. Owen, one of the patrol members, told his team he wanted to go inside the house to check if the thief talked the truth or lied to them. Owen stepped inside and screamed out that someone died in the house. He saw Sophia, the house's owner, had hung herself in the house. Jonathan continued to tell James he knew the laws, so he didn't let anyone to the house. Jonathan asked them if they thought Lucas was the culprit. Once Jonathan reported the case, he thought that Lucas had robbed and killed Sophia, then set up the scene. He didn't have a gut to come inside the house. Jonathan was scared that he had to left any traces in the house, so he came to the police station to report. James replied, "That was a murderer for sure, but the murder was not that poor drunk man." James asked Michael to put the woman down and bring her for autopsy. Michael filed the case and called the other 2 officers to put the woman down. Hearing there was someone had hung, everyone had gathered around and discussed what happened. People knew who she was. That was Sophia. She has married Jackson for more than 20 years. They said that she was a good woman and living a happy life. How could she kill herself? In the crowd, there was an old gray-haired lady. She was following what happened. Once her eyes caught the red shoes in the victim's legs, her face had changed out of the blue, then she vanished to the crowd shortly. James had seen that strange. He turned to Michael and told him to find that old lady. She must have known something. They should invite her to the police station and take her testimony. Michael understood that and quietly left. At the police station, James had scheduled an urgent meeting to analyze the case. He told his team the situation. The victim had hung herself while her husband had gone missing. Regarding what they heard from the neighborhood, the husband had gone missing after her death. For Lucas, the drunk thief, that night, he didn't have time to force open the door, so he was out of the suspect list. The victim had hung herself, but once the team entered the room, she was hung in the beam. Her legs was a meter away from the ground, but there was nothing under her feet. If she wanted to suicide, there must have been something there, such as a chair or table, for her to step in and put her neck in the noose. So they ended up that was a murder case, and her husband, Jackson, who was missing, was the #1 suspect in the case. After James commanded his team to find the husband, Michael pushed the door and stepped in. The panic was visible in his face. He shouted out that there was a lead already. Michael reported that he had invited the old lady from South Village to the police station for testimony. What he heard from her was unbelievable. James went out and reminded Michael of his hastiness and losing control. He told Michael that he wasn't a newbie. How he was such in that hurry and panic, what happened? Michael rubbed his head and reported to James what he had heard from the old lady. The lady had told him that she knew about the red shoes on the victim's legs when she died. It turned out the pair of red shoes, the reason why the old lady got frightened of that day. James continued to ask Michael why she got frightened of it. Did she see it before? Because that pair of shoes had been worn by Death Woman earlier. That sounded weird. Everything had started years ago. A few years ago, South Village had been messed up by a woman. She was an immigrant, came to the village, and worked as a prostitute to live. Women in the village could sense something wrong with their husbands and found out everything. Her name was Julia. Wives in the village had gathered. They beat her violently out of nowhere. They had scolded her with their anger, that she was such a bitch, how shameless she was. How could she seduce all the men in the village, and took out their family happiness? Those wives kept beating, scratching Julia violently. They even cut all off her hair and destroyed her pretty face. Eventually, people found Julia had hung herself home. People thought that she might be too shameful and dishonorable to continue her life. The day Julia hung herself, she wore a pair of red shoes. The creepiest thing was Julia had left them a bloody curse. She had written a curse on the wall by her blood. She cursed who had insulted her, would be died shortly. Everyone who had been involved in beating and cursed Julia that day got scared. They were all regretful for what they had done to her. They had put an end to Julia's life. Their actions had forced Julia to hang herself. On top of that, they were scared that Julia would return to take an act of revenge. Sophia was among those jealous wives. 1 week after the day Julia had died, Rose, who had joined to make the jealous scene, had found hang herself at her house. That was the 7th of the month. On her legs, there were Julia's red shoes. People got confused about that, and no one could explain if the curse really happened to them. James analyzed that must have been a coincidence. Rose probably killed herself because of anxiety. She suicided because she was scared of the bloody curse on the wall at Julia's house earlier. That might be a coincidence, but the pair of shoes was as same as the one Julia wore. A year after Julia's death, Michael continued at her first death anniversary. Another woman had hung herself wearing a pair of red shoes as well. She had joined the jealous scene earlier as well. The day Jonathan, the patrol team leader, had found Sophia's dead body in her house was Julia's second death anniversary. Connecting all those pieces of information, they wondered if Julia had returned to take revenge as what she had written that day. Michael asked James if he believed that was an act of revenge from Julia's angry spirit. Even though everything led to Julia's revenge, but James strongly believed that the vital point was Sophia's husband. The husband was the key to the case. They had to find him out as soon as possible. After days of searching around the area, finally, Sophia's husband had been found out. James had arranged Michael to investigate the husband. Michael asked him the first question: why Jackson left home, and could Jackson please tell him what happened that day. At that moment, Jackson was terrified and got anxious. He told that Julia had ended his wife's life. That was Julia, she had returned. Jackson told Michael everything that night, the night his wife hung herself. That night, when he and his wife were sleeping, out of the blue, his wife got up. She went out of bed. That was a weekday. He barely saw her woke up that early, so he surprisingly asked her how come she woke up that early. Was there anything that mattered to her? But Sophia replied nothing to him. She was likely to ignore his question. Jackson wanted to check her out, but he felt that he could not move his body an inch. The most terrifying to him was once he saw a pair of red shoes there, flew around in the air. The shoes flew to Sophia's place. Then he saw his wife took the shoes in. She tottered to the center of the room. At that moment, Jackson could see there was a noose there in the middle of the room, which had been dropped from the roof beam. Then he had been eyewitnessed in shock. Sophia faced up and eyed to the rope. Her body was likely to be flying up and up high, until her neck was put to the noose. And so, her body had been dropped out. Her neck was tied by the noose. Jackson was scared to death. He tried his best to move. He yelled his wife's name and climbed out of bed. He tried to lift his wife's legs to save her from the strangling, wanted to put her down. Out of nowhere, there was a chair hit strongly to his face. Jackson got hit and fell to the ground. He saw everything in his house was flying. That night, seeing all of those bizarre things happen, he was too scared to stay in the house. He didn't have a gut to touch his wife's dead body there. He tried to run away from his house, the village. He went to the north, but he was unable to forget what happened. He was scared that Julia had come after him and killed him. Jackson recalled and told Michael what happened. He started to stutter and stammer because he was so scared. That was Julia, that woman. She had returned to take her revenge. After the investigation, James left the room first. Michael came after him. To be honest, Jackson's testimony got Michael confused. Once again, he asked James if he believed what Jackson told them was the truth, the return of a dead woman. James didn't give any comment about the testimony from the victim's husband. He asked Michael to drive him to South Village. Even though James didn't speak up directly to Michael, but he knew that his chief had his answer already for the case. He drove the chief to South Village. The car stopped by the village's committee. James wanted to find Jonathan, the patrol team leader. He went straight to the point, asked Jonathan where Julia had been buried. Jonathan replied that Julia was such a shame of the village, so after her death, people buried her at the quiet bottom of South's mountain, which was far away from the village. James asked him to take them to Julia's grave. Jonathan agreed in no time. He took them to South's mountain instantly. They went to a cemetery. Jonathan pointed out a grave and told them that was Julia's grave. James came to her grave. Michael went after him to the grave. They saw that incense sticks were burning. Michael told James, there must have been someone who came to the grave and took care of her grave with incense sticks smoke like that. There was also a plate of cake and a bouquet of flowers. By the first look, the grave was very clean. That people must come to that place very often and clean up the grave as well as cut off the grass around. James knelt down and put up a piece of cake from the plate. He gave a light smile on his full scar's face. He shouted out. Finally, he could find a useful lead. He handed the cake to Michael and requested him to find the cake supplier in the town. Michael got that. The one who took care of Julius' grave must have played a vital role in the case. To find out that one, the only lead was the cake in his hand. After 2 days of seeking, Michael brought James a piece of good news. He found that cake in a sweet booth at Berry Street. The booth owner assured that they could only find that kind of cake at his place, since that was his traditional recipe in years. Michael and James changed their formal clothes and went to Berry Street to find out the sweet booth. Michael showed him the only supplier had that kind of cake. James stood in front of the booth and started to look around. James was likely to find something else. He gave a weird smile and stared at the sign across the street in the opposite. He said that was what he was looking for. Across the street, there was a big sign hanging in the building. The poster's detail was about an annual magic show at the City Opera House. It said, "Hypnotize Master and Amazing Moving Magic." James requested Michael to get back to the police station to secretly gather their team surrounding the opera house. At the same time, he came in and bought a ticket for the show. Michael shortly gathered the team, and after setting up everything, he backed to the opera house to see James and watch the magic show. They came in, and the show started shortly. Once the curtain was opened slowly, a magician was at his 40 stepped in. He bowed his head and welcomed everyone at the stage. The magician performed his magic show. He called out a random audience to the stage and hypnotized him in front of hundreds of people. People were cheering and admiring him with lots of applause. After the hypnotized performance, the magician started to move his hands in the air as if he was making magic. He waved his hand. Out of the blue, all of the furniture on the stage floated in the air. At that moment, Michael was very surprised. He stood up and got spinning around. He quickly recalled what Jackson, Sophia's husband, had told him earlier at night. She hung herself. Seeing Michael was surprised, and the show was nearly ended, the magician would get back to behind the stage. James reminded Michael to pull himself together. They would wait for the magician behind the stage. James and Michael moved to behind the stage and waited for the magician to perform his final trick. After he stepped out of the stage, Michael put his gun to the magician's head. He said that the magician got an undeniable talent, but that was such a waste to use his talent to kill people. The investigation went well. The magician was David. He had confessed that he was Julia's childhood sweetheart. One time, they went to the south for a magic performance. Julia had been kidnapped by human trafficking and nowhere to be found. When David found Julia, she had died already. After hearing the reason why she died, he got resentment for her and wanted to take an act of revenge for his lover. Every year, on her death anniversary, he bought her Oman cake, which was the sweet cake she loved the most. Unfortunately, he was unable to kill those all-cruel women, who had pushed her to death. Regarding how he could kill them, he refused to reply and wanted to keep his magical skills secret because that was the rule. He had taken a vow and could not tell that to anyone. So the truth behind the case had been found out. David had been given a death sentence. He insisted on James one thing before he left. He wanted to be buried along with the pair of red shoes. David wanted to wear Julia's pair of red shoes to walk to her and give them to her because Julia loved wearing that pair of red shoes. Every time he went out to perform, he always brought her one as a gift. James agreed with his last wish and gave a long sigh when seeing he was taken away. Once David died, his magical skills with floating things would be disappeared as well. Such a waste of talent. But the law is the law. There is generosity but show no mercy. He broke the laws and killed people. No matter what was the reason, he had to pay off for his wrongdoing. James turned to Michael and concluded that the case of the pair of red shoes had been solved.